At about 12 o'clock a very distant sound is heard. I make a note here of the fact without being able to give an explanation for it. It is like a continuous roar. Far off, says the professor, is some rock or small island against which the sea is breaking. Hans hoists himself to the top of the mast, but does not signal a reef. The ocean is calm as far as the line of the horizon. 3 hours go by. The roaring seems to come from a distant cataract. I mention this to my uncle, who shakes his head. I, however, am convinced that I am right. Are we heading for some mighty waterfall which will drop us into the abyss? This method of travel will probably please the professor, as it approaches the vertical, but for my part, in any case, not many leagues to windward there must be some very noisy phenomenon, for now the sound of the roaring is extremely loud. Is it coming from the sea or the sky? I look up at the water vapor suspended in the atmosphere, and I try to penetrate its depths. 0.96, but the sky is serene. The clouds, carried up to the very top of the vault, seem motionless, and are completely invisible in the intense glare of the light. We must therefore look elsewhere for the cause of the phenomenon. I scrutinize the horizon, pure and free from all haze. Its appearance is unchanged. But if this noise is coming from a waterfall, from a cataract, if the ocean is being precipitated into a lower cavity, if these roars are being produced by masses of falling waters, there would be a current, and its increasing speed would show me the extent of the danger to which we are exposed. I check the current. There isn't one. An empty bottle we drop in the water simply remains to leeward. At about 4 o'clock Hans stands up, takes hold of the mast, and climbs to the top. From there his eye scans the arc of the ocean's circle before the raft and stops at a particular point. His face expresses no astonishment, but his eyes do not move. He has seen something, says my uncle. So it would seem. Hans climbs down, and stretches his arm out towards the south dernier. Over there, says my uncle. And seizing the telescope, he gazes with great attention for about a minute, which to me appears an age. Yes. Yes. What can you see? A tremendous column of water rising above the waves, 96 its depths, the text from here until the words, although I was certain I was covering ground we hadn't been over before, ch. 39, was added in the 7th edition, 1867. Another sea monster. Perhaps. Then let us head more to the west, for we know what to expect from the dangers of meeting up with antediluvian creatures. Straight ahead, replies my uncle. I turn towards Hans. He maintains course with an inflexible rigor. Nevertheless, given the distance separating us from this creature, which cannot be less than 30 miles, and given that the column of water from its blowhole is clearly visible, its dimensions must be quite preternatural. To flee is therefore the course suggested by basic common sense. To run away would be to obey the most vulgar caution. But we are not here to be prudent. We accordingly press on. The nearer we get, the taller the column of water becomes. What monster can fill itself with such volumes of water and shoot it out so continuously? At 8 p.m., we are not more than 5 miles away. A black, enormous, mountainous body lies on the water like an island. Is it an illusion or is it our fear? It seems not less than a mile long. What then, is this cetaceous monster which Cuvier and Blumenbach 97 never dreamed of? It is motionless as if asleep. The sea seems unable to shift it, it is the waves instead that lap at its side. The water column, rising to a height of 500 feet, breaks into spray with a dull, sullen roar. We advance like lunatics towards that mighty hulk which 100 whales could not feed for a single day. I am terrified. I don't want to go any further. I will cut the halyard if need be. I mutiny openly against the professor, he makes no answer. Suddenly Hans gets up and points at the menacing spot. Home. An island, cries my uncle. An island, I reply, raising my shoulders. Of course, exclaims my uncle, bursting into loud laughter. But what about the water column? Geyser, says Hans. Yes, obviously a geyser, responds my uncle, like those in Iceland. 98 At first I cannot admit that I am so totally wrong. To have taken an is land for a sea monster. 99 But one must give in to the evidence, and finally I have to accept my mistake. There is nothing here but a natural phenomenon. As we get nearer, the dimensions of the column become truly stupendous. It is difficult to tell the difference between the island and an ENOR 97 Blumenbach, Johann Friedrich, 1752-1840, German zoologist and anthropologist, pioneer in craniology. 98 A very famous spring that gushes up, situated at the foot of Mount Hecla. JV, 99 To have taken an island for a sea monster, this section announces Vingt mille loups sous les mers, which begins with evidence of a supernatural seeming sea monster, mouse whale, with its head rising 60 feet above the swell. The geyser, a word the Icelanders pronounce geysir, and which means fury, emerges majestically at one end of the island. Dull detonations are heard every now and then, and the enormous jet, subject to violent rages, shakes off its plume of vapor and spurts up as far as the first stratum of cloud. It is alone. Neither exhalations nor hot springs surround it, and the whole volcanic power is concentrated in it. Rays of electric light come and mix with this dazzling column, with each drop taking on all the colors of the prism. Let's go alongside, says the professor. We have to take precautions, however, to avoid the water column, which would sink the raft in an instant. Hans, steering skillfully, takes us to the other end of the island. I leap onto the rock. My uncle nimbly follows, while the hunter remains at his post, like a man beyond such wonders. We walk over granite mixed with silicious tuff, the soil shivers under our feet like the sides of boilers writhing with superheated steam, it feels burning hot. We come in view of the little central hollow from which the geyser rises. I plunge an overflow thermometer 100 into the water bubbling from the center, it registers a temperature of 163 degrees. This water, therefore, comes from a burning source of heat. This is singularly in contradiction with Professor Leidenbrock's theories. I cannot resist pointing it out. Well, says he, what does that prove against my theory? Nothing, I reply shortly, seeing that I am up against an implacable stubbornness. Nevertheless, I am forced to confess that we have been remarkably fortunate up until now, and that, for a reason which still escapes me, our journey is taking place in unusual conditions of temperature. But it appears evident, nay certain, that sooner or later we shall arrive at one of those regions where the central heat reaches its utmost limits and goes far beyond the gradations on the thermometers. We shall see. That is now the professor's favorite phrase. Having baptized the volcanic island with the name of his nephew, he gives the signal to embark. I stand still for a few minutes more, staring at the geyser. I notice that the jet of water is irregular in its outbursts, it diminishes in intensity, then regains new vigor, which I attribute to variations in the pressure of the vapor built up in its reservoir. At last we leave, avoiding the sheer rocks of the southern side. Hans has taken advantage of this brief halt to reorganize the raft. Before we put off, however, I make a few observations to calculate the distance covered, and note them in my logbook. Since Port Grauben, 100 and overflow thermometer, the first cousin of the escapement clock which generates Maitre Zacharias, 1854, with clear Freudian overtones, we have covered 680 miles. We are now 1,550 miles from Iceland, and underneath Britain. 101:35 Friday the 21st of August. The following day the magnificent geyser has disappeared. The wind has freshened, and quickly takes us away from Axel Island. The roaring sound gradually dies down. The weather, if such a term may be used here, is about to change. The atmosphere is gradually being loaded with water vapor, which rise with it the electricity generated when the salt waters evaporate. The clouds are lowering perceptibly and taking on a uniform olive hue, the electric rays can scarcely pierce this opaque curtain which has fallen on a stage where a stormy drama is going to be enacted. I feel peculiarly influenced, like all creatures on Earth when a catastrophe is about to happen. The cumuli, 102 piled up in the south present a sinister appearance, they have the pitiless look I have often noticed at the beginning of a storm. The air is heavy, the sea calm. In the distance, the clouds look like enormous bales of cotton, piled up in picturesque confusion. They gradually swell up, and gain in size what they lose in number, they are so heavy that they are unable to hoist themselves from the horizon. But in the breath from the upper streams of the air, they gradually melt together, become darker and soon present a single layer of a formidable appearance, now and then a ball of misty cloud, still lit up, collides with the grey carpet, and is soon swallowed up by the impenetrable mass. There can be no doubt that the entire atmosphere is saturated with fluid, I am impregnated with it, my hair stands on end as if beside an electric machine. It occurs to me that if one of my companions touched me now, he would probably get a violent shock. At 10 a.m., the symptoms of the storm become more pronounced, the wind seems to soften in order to draw breath again, as if in preparation, the cloud resembles a goatskin bottle inside which terrible storms are accumulating. I do not want to accept the evidence of the sky's menacing signs, and yet I cannot stop myself saying, it looks as though we are going to have some bad weather. The professor does not answer. He is in an atrocious mood at the sight of the ocean stretching interminably before his eyes. At my words he shrugs his shoulders. We're going to have a storm, I continue, pointing towards the horizon. These clouds are lowering upon the sea, as if to crush it. A great silence. The wind falls. Nature lies as if dead, ceasing to breathe. Upon the mast, where I can already see a slight St. Elmo's fire, the sail hangs in loose, heavy folds. The raft is motionless in the midst of that sticky sea, without swell. But since we are not moving, what is the 101 underneath Britain, in fact central France? 102 Clouds with round shapes. JV point of maintaining the canvas, for it may be our downfall as soon as the tempest hits us. Let's lower the sail, let's bring down the mast. That would be the sensible thing to do. No, for God's sake, cries my uncle, 100 times, no. May the wind take hold of us, may the storm sweep us away. Let me finally see the rocks of some shore, even if the raft must break into smithereens on them. These words are scarcely out of his mouth than the appearance of the southern horizon is transformed. The accumulated moisture resolves itself into water, and the air, violently sucked in to fill the vacuum produced by the condensation, becomes a raging storm. It comes from the most distant corners of the cabin. The darkness increases. I can only just take a few incomplete notes. The raft rises, it leaps. My uncle is cast down. I drag myself over to him. He is holding on to the end of a rope with all his might, apparently gazing with pleasure at the spectacle of the unchained elements. Hans does not move a muscle. His long hair, pushed down over his motionless face by the tempest, gives him a strange appearance, for the end of each hair is illuminated by a tiny, feather-like radiation. His frightening mask is that of an antediluvian man, living at the time of the ichthyosaurus and megatherium. The mast still holds. The sail stretches like a bubble about to burst. The raft hurtles on at a velocity that I cannot estimate, but is still slower than the drops of water displaced beneath it, which the speed turns into clean straight lines. The sail, I cry, gesturing that it should be brought down. No, nay, says Hans, gently shaking his head. By now, the rain forms a roaring cataract in front of this horizon towards which we race like madmen. But before we reach it, the veil of cloud is torn apart, the sea begins to boil, and the electricity, produced by some great chemical action in the upper layers, is brought into play. Dazzling streaks of lightning combine with fearful claps of thunder, flashes without number criss-cross amongst the crashes. The mass of water vapor becomes incandescent, the hailstones striking the metal of our tools and firearms become luminous, each of the waves surging up resembles a fire-breathing breast, in which seethes an internal radiance, with each peak surmounted by plumes of flames. My eyes are dazzled by the intensity of the light, my ears deafened by the din of the thunder. I am forced to hold on to the mast, which bends like a reed before the violence of the storm. Here my travel notes became very incomplete. I have only found one or two fleeting observations, jotted down automatically so to speak. But even in their brevity, their incoherence, they are imprinted with the feelings which governed me and thus, better than my memory, portray my mood at the time. Sunday the 23rd of August. Where are we? Being carried away with immeasurable speed. The night has been awful. The storm is not calming down. We are living in the midst of an uproar, a constant detonation. Our ears are bleeding. We are unable to exchange a single word. The lightning never stops striking. I see the retrograde zigzags flashing rapidly and then working their way back up to crash into the arch of the granite roof. What if it collapsed? Other flashes of lightning fork or become globes of fire and explode like bombshells. The general level of noise does not seem to be increased by this, it has already gone beyond the order of magnitude that the human ear can distinguish. If all the powder magazines in the world were to explode at the same time, it would not make any difference. There is a constant production of light from the surface of the clouds, their molecules incessantly give off electrical matter, the gaseous principles of the air have been changed, innumerable columns of water leap up into the air and then fall down foaming. Where are we going? My uncle is still flat out at the front of the raft. The heat increases even further. I look at the thermometer, it reads. The figure is illegible. Monday the 24th of August. Will this terrible storm ever end? Why should this state of hyper-dense atmosphere, once it has been modified, not remain as it is indefinitely? We are broken with fatigue. Hans the same as ever. The raft heads endlessly southeast. We have already done 500 miles since Axel Island. At noon the tempest becomes a hurricane. We are forced to lash down every item in the cargo. Each of us ties himself down as well. The waves pass over our heads. Impossible to say a single word to each other for the last 3 days. We open our mouths, we move our lips, no audible sound is produced. Even speaking directly into the ear does not work. My uncle comes close. He pronounces some words. I think he says, we are lost. I am not certain. I make up my mind, and write a few words to him, let's take in the sail. He nods to indicate his consent. His head has not had time to resume its original position, when a disk of fire appears on the edge of the raft. The mast and sail are carried off in a single movement, and I see them fly away to a tremendous height like a pterodactyl, that fantastic bird of the earliest centuries. We are frozen with terror. The ball is half white, half electric blue, of the size of a 10-inch bombshell. It moves leisurely around, while turning with an astonishing speed under the lash of the storm. It wanders about here and there, it clambers onto one of the cross beams of the raft, jumps on the food bag, gives a little leap, then lightly touches our powder keg. Horror, we are about to explode. But no, the blinding disc moves to one side, it goes up to Hans, who stares at it without blinking, then to my uncle, who throws himself on his knees to avoid it. It comes towards me, as I stand pale and shivering in the dazzling heat and light, it pirouettes near my feet, which I try to pull back. I can't. A smell of nitrous gas fills the air, it penetrates our throats and lungs. We choke on it. Why can't I move my foot? Is it riveted to the spot? Then I understand, the arrival of the electric globe has magnetized all the iron on board. 103 The instruments, the tools, the firearms are crashing together with a keen jangling noise, the nails in my boot are violently attracted to a plate of iron encrusted in the wood. I can't shift my foot. At last, by a violent effort, I tear my foot away, just as the rotational movements of the ball are about to seize hold of it and drag me away to, if. Oh, what intense light. The globe bursts, we are being covered in torrents of flames. Then everything goes out. I just have time to see my uncle lying on the floor, Hans still at the helm, spitting fire, under the influence of the electricity, he is saturated with it. Where will we end up, oh where? Tuesday the 25th of August. I have just come out of a very long faint. The storm is still continuing, the lightning breaks loose like a swarm of snakes released into the air. Are we still on the sea? Yes, being carried along with incalculable speed. We have passed under Britain, under the Channel, under France, possibly under the whole of Europe. 104. A new noise can be heard. Clearly the sea breaking on rocks. But then, 36. Here ends what I called the ship's log, fortunately saved from the shipwreck. I proceed with my narrative as before. What happened when the raft hit the reefs on the shore, I cannot say. I felt myself being thrown into the waves, and if I escaped death, if my 103 magnetized board, Le Sphinx des Glaces, 1897, which culminates at an immense magnetic center near the North Pole, is foreshadowed in this scene, 104 past. Europe, in Laternal Atom, 1910, this scene is paralleled when the protagonists sail in search of land over the successive countries of a flooded Europe. Body was not torn to pieces by the sharp rocks, it was because Hans's strong arm pulled me from the abyss. The fearless Icelander carried me out of reach of the waves and onto burning sand, where I found myself lying side by side with my uncle. Then he returned to the rocks, against which the furious waves were beating, in order to save a few stray pieces from the wreckage. I could not speak, I was broken with fear and fatigue, it took me more than an hour to recover. The rain continued to fall, however, a positive deluge, but with that very violence which heralds the end of the storm. Some piled up rocks gave us protection from the torrents from the heavens. Hans prepared some food which I was unable to touch. Exhausted by the 3 nights keeping watch, I fell into a disturbed sleep. Next day, the weather was magnificent. Sea and sky, as if by agreement, had regained their serenity. Every trace of the storm had disappeared. Cheerful words from the professor greeted me when I woke up. His gaiety was terrible. Well, my lad, did you sleep soundly? Might one not have thought that we were in the old house in Königstrasse, that I was quietly coming down for breakfast, and that my wedding with poor Grauben was to take place that very day? Alas, if only the tempest had driven the raft eastwards, we would have passed under Germany, under my beloved city of Hamburg, under that street which contained all I loved in the world. At that point hardly 100 miles would have separated me from her. But 100 vertical miles of granite wall, in reality, more than 2,500 miles to cover. All these unhappy ideas passed quickly through my mind before I answered my uncle's question. What? He repeated. Can you not say how you slept? Perfectly. But every bone in my body aches. I'll be all right. I am sure you will be completely all right, a little tired, nothing more. You appear very gay this morning. Delighted, my boy, delighted. We have arrived. At the end of our expedition. No, at the edge of that sea which seemed endless. We will now resume our journey by land, and really plunge into the vitals of the earth. Uncle, can I ask you a question? Certainly, Axel. How are we going to get back? Get back. You are thinking about the return before we have even arrived. Not really, all I want to know is how will it be done? In the simplest way possible. Once we have reached the center of our spheroid, either we shall find a new path to climb up to the surface, or we shall quite boringly turn round and go back the way we came. I do not imagine that the route will close up behind us. Then we will have to think about repairing the raft. Obviously. But what about the food? Have we got enough left to do all these great things? Yes, certainly. Hans is a clever fellow, and I am sure he has saved most of the cargo. But let's go and see for ourselves. We left this grotto, open to all the winds. I had a hope that was also a fear. It didn't seem possible to me that anything of what the raft had been carrying could have survived its terrible landing. I was wrong. When I reached the shore, I found Hans in the middle of a large number of objects, all laid out in order. My uncle wrung the hunter's hands with deep gratitude. This man, of a superhuman devotion, one that would perhaps never be equaled, had worked while we slept, saving the most precious articles at the risk of his life. Nevertheless, we had experienced important losses, our firearms for example, but after all we could manage without them. The supply of powder had remained intact, after narrowly escaping being blown up in the storm. Well, said the professor, as we have no guns, we will simply have to give up hunting. Yes, but what about the instruments? Here is the manometer, the most useful of all, and for which I would have given the rest. With it I can calculate the depth and know when we have reached the center. Without it, we might go too far and come out at the antipodes. His good mood was ferocious. But the compass. Here it is on this rock, safe and sound, as well as the chronometer and thermometers. The hunter is a genius. One had to agree. Amongst the instruments, nothing was missing. As for the tools and implements, I spotted ladders, cords, pickaxes, picks, etc., scattered over the sand. There was still the question of provisions to sort out. And what about the food? Let us see about it. The boxes were lined up along the shore in a perfect state of preservation, most of their contents were unharmed by the sea, and we could thus still count on a total of 4 months' supply of biscuits, salt meat, gin, and dried fish. 4 months! Cried the professor. We have time to go there and come back, and with what is left I plan to give a huge dinner to my colleagues at the Johanneum. By this time I should have been used to my uncle's character, and yet this man still amazed me. Now, said he, we must renew our stock of fresh water, using the rain that the storm has poured into the hollows in the granite. There is no danger of suffering from thirst. As for the raft, I shall ask Hans to repair it as best he can, although I do not believe we shall be requiring it again. Why not? Just one of my ideas, my boy. I do not believe we shall go out the way we came in. I looked at my uncle with suspicion. I wondered whether he had gone mad. And yet, little did he know how right he was. And now for breakfast, he concluded. I followed him on to a high promontory, after he had given instructions to the hunter. There, with dried meat, biscuits, and tea, we had an excellent meal, one of the best in my life, I must say. Hunger, the open air, the peace and quiet after the excitement, all combined to give me an excellent appetite. During breakfast, I asked my uncle if he knew where we now were. It may be rather difficult to calculate, I added. To calculate exactly, yes, even impossible, for I could keep no account of the speed or direction of the raft during the 3 days of the tempest. Still, we can estimate our approximate position. Well, our last observation was made at the island with the geyser. At Axel Island, my boy. Do not decline the honor of giving your name to the first island discovered in the interior of the earth. All right. At Axel Island, we had done more than 670 miles by sea and were over 1,500 miles from Iceland. Fine. Let us start then from that point, and count 4 days of storm, during which our speed cannot have been less than 200 miles every 24 hours. Very probably. That would make as much as 800 miles extra. Yes, and the Leidenbrock Sea would then be about 1,500 miles across. Do you realize, Axel, that it is about as big as the Mediterranean? Yes, especially if we have only crossed it and not gone its whole length. Which is very likely. And what is strange, said I, is that if our calculations are right, we have over our heads at this very moment the Mediterranean itself. Do you think so? Yes, for we are 2,300 miles from Reykjavik. A good stretch of road we have traveled, my boy. But whether we are under the Mediterranean, Turkey, or the Atlantic can only be determined if our direction has remained constant. The wind appears steady to me. My view is that this shore must be southeast of Port Grouben. Well, it is easy to check by consulting the compass. Let us therefore go and check this compass. The professor headed for the rock on which Hans had placed the instruments. My uncle was gay and light-hearted, he rubbed his hands, he struck poses. A young man in truth. I followed him, rather curious to know whether I was right in my estimation. As soon as we had reached the rock, my uncle took the compass, laid it flat and looked at the needle, which oscillated and then, under the magnetic influence, stopped in a fixed position. My uncle looked, rubbed his eyes, then looked again. Finally he turned to me, flabbergasted. But what's the matter? He pointed to the instrument. I examined it and a loud cry of surprise escaped from my lips. The needle marked north where we expected south. It pointed at the shore rather than out to sea. I shook the compass, then examined it again. It was in perfect condition. Whatever position we made the needle take, it returned obstinately to the same surprising direction. There could be no doubt about it. During the tempest, there had been a sudden change of wind, one we had not noticed, and which had brought the raft back to the shores my uncle thought he had left behind forever. 37. It would be altogether impossible for me to give any idea of the feelings that shook the professor: amazement, incredulity, and finally rage. Never in my life had I seen someone so crestfallen at first, and then so furious. The fatigues of our crossing, the dangers we had passed through, everything had to be started all over again. Instead of making progress, we had gone backwards. But my uncle was on top again very soon. Fate plays me such tricks. The elements are conspiring against me. Air, fire, and water are combining to stop me getting through. Well, they are going to see what my willpower can do. I shall not yield. I shall not retreat a tenth of an inch. We shall see who wins, man or nature. Standing on a rock, irritated, threatening, Otto Leidenbrock, like wild Ajax, 105 seemed to be hurling defiance at the gods. I judged it sensible to intervene and put some sort of check upon this mad eagerness. Listen to me, I said in a firm voice. There must be a limit to every ambition in this world. One must not fight against the impossible. We are ill-equipped for a sea voyage. One cannot cover 1,200 miles on a poor construction of beams, with a blanket as a sail and a stick for a mast, against the unleashed winds. Since we are unable to steer, we will become the playthings of the storm, and it is to act like lunatics to attempt this impossible crossing a second time. I was allowed to go through these irrefutable reasons for about 10 minutes without interruption. But this was only because of the professor's inattention. He did not hear a single word of my arguments. To the raft, he cried. Such was his response. In vain did I implore him. Did I lose my temper? I came up against a will harder than granite. 105 Wild Ajax, in Greek mythology, a hero of the Trojan War, who defied the gods and whom Poseidon caused to fall into the sea and drown. Hans was just finishing his repairs to the raft. It was almost as if this strange being had guessed my uncle's projects. By means of a few pieces of surtarbrander, he had strengthened the vessel. A sail had already been hoisted, and the wind was playing over its floating folds. The professor said a few words to the guide, who immediately loaded our luggage on board and prepared everything for departure. The atmosphere was now pure, and the northwest wind held steady. What could I do? Resist, 1 against 2. Impossible. If only Hans had supported me. But no, as far as I could see, the Icelander had set aside all volition of his own and taken a vow of self-denial. I could get nothing out of a servant so futilely subjugated to his master. All I could do was not rock the boat. I moved 106 to take my usual place on the raft, but my uncle stopped me with his hand. We shall only start tomorrow. I made the gesture of a man resigned to everything. I must not neglect a single factor. As fate has cast me upon this stretch of shore, I shall not leave again until I have explored it. In order to understand his remark, I need to explain that, though we had come back to the northern coastline, this was not at exactly the same spot as our starting point. Port Gräuben had to be to the west. Hence nothing was more sensible than carefully reconnoitering the area around our new landfall. Let's explore, I cried. And we set off, leaving Hans to his activities. The area between the high water tide mark and the foot of the cliffs was very large. It would take about half an hour to get to the rock wall. Our feet crushed innumerable seashells of every shape and size, once the houses of animals of the first ages. I also noticed enormous shells with a diameter of more than 15 feet. They once belonged to those gigantic glyptodonts 107 of the Pliocene period, of which the modern tortoise is but a minute reduction. In addition, the soil was covered with a large amount of stony jetsam, a sort of shingle rounded by the waves, arranged in successive rows. I came to the conclusion that in past ages the sea must have covered this area. The waves had indeed left evident signs of their passage on the scattered rocks, now lying beyond their reach. This could to a certain extent explain the existence of such an ocean, 100 miles below the surface of the earth. According to my theory, this liquid mass must have been gradually lost into the bowels of the earth. It clearly came from the water of the oceans, reaching its destination through some sort of fissure. Nevertheless, it had to be assumed that 106 I moved, July, 1864 edition, I was going to Jules. The difference of a single letter, phonologically minimal and without much significance for the primary meaning, has nevertheless an important consequence on conceptions of tense in the novel. In particular, it marks a distinction between action and intention, between objective movement and internal reflection. 107 Glyptodonts, extinct mammals in S. America, resembling giant armadillos. This fissure was now blocked up, for, if not the cavern, or rather the immense reservoir, would have been completely filled in a relatively short period. Perhaps some of the water had even had to contend with the subterranean fires, and so was vaporized. Hence an explanation for the clouds suspended above our heads and the emission of the electricity which created the storms inside the Earth's mass. Such a theory of the phenomena we had witnessed struck me as satisfactory, for however great the marvels of nature, they can always be explained with physical reasons. We were thus walking over a kind of sedimentary soil formed by the subsidence of the waters, like the very many formations of that period on the surface of the globe. The professor carefully examined every crack in the rocks. If an opening existed, it became vital for him to plumb its depths. We had been following the shores of the Leidenbrock Sea for about a mile, when suddenly the ground changed appearance. It seemed to have been turned upside down by a violent upheaval of the lower strata. In many places, hollows and hillocks bore witness to great dislocations of the terrestrial mass. 108 We were advancing with difficulty over the broken granite mixed with flint, quartz, and alluvial deposits, when a field, more than a field, a plain of bones, appeared before our eyes. It looked like an immense cemetery, where the generations of 2,000 years mingled their eternal dust. Large bulges 109 of remains stretched out in the layered distance. They undulated away to the limits of the horizon and were lost in an out-of-focus mist. Within that area, of perhaps 3 square miles, was accumulated the whole history of animal life, writ too small in the recent ground of the inhabited world. We were carried forward by an impetuous curiosity. With a dry sound our feet crushed the remains of these prehistoric animals, whose rare and valuable fragments are fought over by the museums of the great cities. 1,000 Cuviers would not have been enough to reconstruct the skeletons of all the once living creatures which now rested in that magnificent bone graveyard. I remained dumbfounded. My uncle had raised his long arms towards the impenetrable vault which was our sky. His mouth was gaping tremendously, his eyes were flaring behind the lenses of his glasses, his head was moving up and down, to the left and right, his whole expression indicated utter astonishment. He was presented with a priceless assortment of Leptothuria, Maricotheria, Lephiodons, Anoplothers, Megatheria, Mastodons, Protopitheci, pterodactyls, of every monster from before the flood, all in a pile there just for his gratification. Imagine the famous library in Alexandria that Omar burnt, suddenly and miraculously reborn. 108 Great dislocations of the terrestrial mass. The text here bears witness to its own eruption into the previous edition. 109 Large bulges, vernes, extumescences, is a medical term meaning tumefactions. He is perhaps also making a pun, extumescences, from its ashes, and transport a fanatical book collector into it. That was my uncle Professor Leidenbrock. But his awe reached a climax when, racing across the organic dust, he seized a bare skull and screamed in a trembling voice, "Axel, Axel! It's a human head! A human head!" I replied, just as dazed. "Yes, my boy. Oh, Milne Edwards, 110 quatrefages. How I wish you could see me here, Otto Leidenbrock." 38 To explain this reference to the two distinguished scientists, it should be recalled that a paleontological event of great importance had taken place some months before our departure. On the 28th of March 1863, French workmen under the direction of M. Boucher de Perthes 111 had unearthed a human jawbone at a depth of 14 feet below the soil, in a quarry at Moulin-Quignon, near Abbeville, Somme. It was the first fossil of the sort ever to see the light of day. Near it were stone axes and worked flints, which time had covered with a uniform colloured patina. This discovery had a huge impact, not only in France but in Britain and Germany. Many scholars from the Institut Français, including Messrs. Milne Edwards and Quatrefages, took the affair very much to heart, demonstrated the incontestable authenticity of the bones in question, and hence became the most impassioned defense witnesses in the trial of the jawbone, as it was called in Britain. In addition to the United Kingdom geologists who considered the fact as certain, Messrs. Falconer, 112 Busk, Carpenter, et al., stood the Ger man scholars. Amongst the most eminent, the most enthusiastic, the most carried away, was my uncle Leidenbrock. The authenticity of a human fossil from the Quaternary era seemed therefore proved and approved beyond all shadow of a doubt. 110 Milne Edwards, Henri, 1800–85, French zoologist, worked especially on mollusks and crustaceans. Quatrefages, Jean-Louis Armand de Quatrefages de Biarri-Acuto, 1810–92, French naturalist and anthropologist, opponent of Darwinism, author of Histoire de l'Homme, 1867. 111 Boucher of Perthes, 1788–1868, discovered flint tools near Abbeville in 1837 and 1844, and argued from 1846 onwards that man had existed in prehistoric times. Only following their first recognition in Britain in 1860 were his arguments really debated in France, in 1865, hence the extra chapters in 1867. The theme of the undiscovered genius is an important one in Verne. 112 Falconer, Hugh, 1808-65, British paleontologist and botanist. Busk, George, 1807-86, British specialist in the fossil marine Paleozoa, author of several scientific works, including description of the remains of 3 extinct species of elephant. 1865 Carpenter, William Benjamin, 1813-85, British physiologist and author of A Popular Cyclopedia of Natural Science, 1841-4, and Zoology, and Chief Forms of Fossil Remains, 1857, reissued 1866, also an expert on dredging the ocean depths, also author of The Unconscious Action of the Brain, 1866-71. Such a view, it is true, was vigorously challenged by M. Elie de Beaumont. 113 This authoritative and respected scientist maintained that the formation of Moulin Quignon did not belong to the Diluvium, but was more recent. In agreement with Cuvier on this point, he contended that the human race could not have existed at the same time as the animals of the Quaternary era. But my uncle Leidenbrock, in accordance with the great majority of geologists, had held his ground, had argued and discussed, and M. Elie de Beaumont had remained relatively isolated in his view. My uncle and I were familiar with the successive ins and outs of this affair. But what we did not know was that, after we had left, it had undergone further developments. Additional jawbones of the same sort, alt-huff belonging to individuals of different types and different nations, were discovered in the loose gray soil of certain large caves in France, Switzerland, and Belgium, together with weapons, utensils, tools, and the bones of children, adolescents, adults, and old people. The existence of Quaternary man became therefore more and more certain with each passing day. And this was not all. New fragments excavated in Pliocene formations from the Tertiary period had enabled scientists with even livelier imaginatians to attribute a much greater age to the human race. These fragments, it is true, were not human bones, but merely the products of his industry, tibias and femurs of fossil animals, marked with regular grooves, carved so to speak, bearing the signs of man's handiwork. Thus, in a single move, man had leapt many centuries up the ladder of time. He now came before the mastodon, he became a contemporary of the Elephas meridionalis. 114 His ENC dated back 100,000 years, since that was when the geologists said the Pliocene system was formed. The above elements constituted the state of paleontological science at that time, and what we knew of them was sufficient to explain our reaction to this ossuary beside the Leidenbrock Sea. My uncle's stupefaction and joy are easy to understand, especially when, 20 yards further on, he found himself in the presence of, or rather face to face with, an authentic specimen of Quaternary man. It was a perfectly recognizable human body. Had some particularity of the soil, as in the Saint Michel Cemetery in Bordeaux, preserved it unchanged down through the centuries. It was difficult to say. But in any case this body was before our eyes exactly as it had lived, complete with stretched, parchment-like skin, limbs still fleshy and soft, apparently at least, teeth still preserved, a considerable head of hair, and finger and toe-nails of a frightening length. 113 Elie de Beaumont, 1798-1874, French geologist, argued against the existence of prehistoric man. 114 Elephas meridionalis, southern elephant, lived in Eurasia in the Quaternary era. I was dumbstruck at this apparition from another age. My uncle, USULI possessed of such a way with words, normally so eager to make speeches about anything, fell silent as well. We propped the body up against a rock. He looked at us from his hollow eye sockets. We twanged his sonorous chest. After a few moments of silence, my uncle reverted to Herr Professor Otto Leidenbrock, undoubtedly carried away by his personality and forgetting the circumstances of the journey, our immediate surroundings, and the tremendous cabin holding us. He must have thought he was lecturing to his students at the Johanneum, for he adopted a professorial tone and addressed an imaginary audience. Gentlemen, I have the pleasure of introducing to you a man from the Quaternary era. Some eminent scholars have argued that he does not exist, while others, no less eminent, have maintained that he does. The doubting Thomases of paleontology, if they were here, would be able to touch his body with their hands, and thus be forced to admit their error. I know full well that science must be constantly on its guard concerning discoveries of this sort. I am not unaware of the exploitation of fossil men by the Barnums 115 and other charlatans of this world. I am not acquainted with the story of Ajax's kneecap, with what was claimed to be Orest's body 116 as found by the Spartans, or with Asteria's 10-cubit-long body as described by Pausanias. I have read the reports on the Trapani skeleton discovered in the 14th century, which people wished to believe was Polyphemus, as well as the accounts of the giant dug up in the 16th century near Palermo. You are as aware as I, gentlemen, of the analysis carried out at Lucerne in 1577 of the enormous bones claimed by the illustrious Dr. Felix Plater to belong to a giant 19 feet tall. I have devoured Cassonion's treatises, and all the monographs, pamphlets, presentations, and counter-presentations ever published on the skeleton of Teutobochus, king of the Cimbrians, who invaded Gaul and who was excavated from a sandpit in the Dauphiné in 1613.117 in the 18th century. I would have combated Peter Camp 115 Barnum's, Phineas Taylor Barnum, 1810-91, famous American showman, also prominent in Verne's La Humbug. 116 Orestes' body, Orest, mythological son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, Asturias. All of Verne's information about giants, including the proper names, is taken directly from Figuier, pp. 300-3. The Trapani giant is in turn cited from Boccaccio, 1313-75, Pausanias, Greek traveler, topographer, and author, c. AD 100. His best-known work was translated as Pausanias, Au voyage historique de la Grèce. Nouvelle édition augmentée écudée du Voyageateur du monde par Silax, 1797. 117 Trapani and Palermo, in Sicily, Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, Greek god of the sea and of earthquakes, and one of the Cyclopes, Felix Plater, Felix Plater or Platerus, in Latin, the elder and the younger, German physiologists, studied in Montpellier in 16th century, Cassonion, Jean Chassonion or Joannes Cassonio, author of De Gigantibus, Eorum que Reliquius, Atqui ijs que anti and nos aliquad nostra aetate and Gallia repert, sunt, Ball, 1580, Cimbrians, or Cimbri, German tribe originally from N. Jutland, but retreated northwards in Third Er's affirmations regarding the existence of Schweizer's pre-Adamites. I have held in my hands the publication entitled Guy. Here re-emerged my uncle's inherent impediment of not being able to pronounce complicated words in public. The book entitled Guy Gans. He couldn't go any further. Guy Ganteo. Impossible, the wretched word just would not come out. There would have been much laughter at the Johanneum. Gigantosteology, Professor Leidenbrock said, between two oaths. Then, continuing all the better, and warming up, yes, gentlemen, I am aware of all these matters. I also know that C.U. Veer and Blumenbach have identified the bones as simply those of mammoths and other animals of the Quaternary period. But to doubt in the present case would be to insult science. The corpse is there. You can inspect it, touch it. It is not a mere skeleton, it is an entire body, preserved for exclusively anthropological purposes. I was careful not to contradict this assertion. If I could wash it in a solution of sulfuric acid, I would remove all the earthen crustaceans and splendid shells attached to it. But the pre-CIOUS solvent is unavailable at present. However, as it stands, this body will recount its own story. Here, the professor picked up the fossil corpse and adjusted it with all the dexterity of a showman at a fair. As you can see, it is less than 6 feet tall, and we are a long way from the so-called giants. As for the race it belongs to, it is incontestably Caucasian. It is of the white race, it is of our own race. The skull of this fossil is oval-shaped and regular, without developed cheekbones, without a projecting jaw. It presents no sign of prognathism modifying the facial angle. 118-119 measure this angle, it is nearly 90 degrees. But I will proceed further along the path of deductions, and I will venture to say that this human specimen belongs to the Japhetic family, which extends century, and thus probably introduced the use of the runic alphabet into Norway and Sweden. Teutobochus, Figuier, pp. 262-3, reports that Teutobochus rex was in fact merely the bones of a giant mammal but was fraudulently exhibited in every town in France. Peter Camper, 1722-89, Dutch anatomist, author of works on mammalian anatomy. Schweitzer, Johann Jacob, Swiss author of SE Lections from the Bible dealing with natural history, especially Homo diluviitis tis, 1731, and Physique sacrée ou histoire naturelle de la Bible, 1732, describing fossil remains believed to be human ones from the flood. The Gigantosteology that Leidenbrock stutters over is by N. Habakkuk, 1613. 118 The facial angle is formed by the intersection of two planes, one more or less vertical and forming a tangent to the forehead and the incisor teeth, the other horizontal, passing through the opening of the auditory passages and the lower nasal cavity. One defines prognathism, in anthropological language, as this projection of the jaw bone modifying the facial angle. JV 119 The facial angle, in the racist theories current at the time, it was the facial angle that helped determine the race, from the Indian subcontinent to the far limits of Western Europe. Pray do not smile, gentlemen. Nobody was smiling, but the professor was used to seeing faces broadening during his scholarly perorations. Yes, he continued with renewed vigor, this is a fossil man, and a contemporary of the mastodons whose bones fill this auditorium. But by what route it arrived here, how the strata it was enclosed in slid down into this enormous cavity of the globe, I am unable to tell you. Undoubtedly, in the Quaternary period, considerable upheavals in the Earth's crust still occurred. The lengthy cooling of the globe produced fissures, cracks, and faults, into which part of the upper terrain must have dropped. I am not committing myself, but, after all, this man is here, surrounded by the handiwork he produced, his axes and worked flints which define the Stone Age. Unless he came as a tourist, as a scientific pioneer, I cannot then question the authenticity of his ancient origin. The professor stopped speaking, and I broke into unanimous applause. My uncle was in fact right, and more learned people than his nephew would have found it very difficult to argue with him. Another clue. This fossilized body was not the only one in the Enor Mouse ossuary. With each step we took in this dust, we came across other bodies. My uncle was able to pick out the most wonderful specimens that would have convinced the most skeptical. It was indeed an amazing sight, that of generations of men and animals mingling in this cemetery. But a puzzling mystery then arose that we were not yet able to solve. Had these creatures slid down to the shores of the Leidenbrock Sea during some convulsion of the earth when they were already dead? Or had they rather passed their lives down here, in this underworld, under this unnatural sky, being born and dying here, just like the inhabitants of the earth? Until now, only monsters of the deep and fish had appeared before us in living form. Was some man of the abyss still wandering along these lonely shores? 39 For another half hour we trampled over the layers of bones. We went straight ahead, forced on by a burning curiosity. What other wonders did this cavern hold, what treasures of science? My eyes expected every surprise, my mind every astonishment. The seashore had long since disappeared behind the hills of the bone graveyard. The foolhardy professor, heedless of losing the way, led us further and further on. We walked in silence, bathed in the waves of electric light. By a phenomenon I cannot explain, the light was uniformly diffused, so that it lit up all the sides of objects equally. It no longer came from any definite point in space, and consequently there was not the slightest shadow. It was like being under the vertical rays of the midday sun in midsummer in the midst of the equatorial regions. All mist had disappeared. The rocks, the distant mountains, the blurry forms of a few faraway forests, all took on a strange appearance under the even distribution of the luminous fluid. We were like that fantastic character of Hoffmann's who lost his shadow. 120 After about a mile, we saw the edge of an immense forest, but not this time a grove of mushrooms like the one near Port Grauben. It displayed the vegetation of the Tertiary period in all its splendor. Great palm trees of species no longer in existence and superb palmaceae pines, yews, cypress, and thujas 121 represented the coniferous family, all joined together by an impenetrable network of creepers. The ground was carpeted with a springy covering of moss and hepaticas. Streams murmured under the shade, if this term can be used, for there was no shadow. On the banks flourished tree ferns, like those of the hothouses of the inhabited globe. Colors, however, were absent from all the trees, shrubs, and plants, deprived as they were of the life-giving heat of the sun. Writhing was dissolved into a uniform hue, brownish and faded as if passed. The leaves were not their usual green, and the very flowers, so numerous in the Tertiary age when they first appeared, were at that time without color or perfume, as if made of a paper that had been yellowed by the effect of the atmosphere. My uncle ventured into this gigantic thicket. I followed, not without a certain apprehension. Where nature had provided such vast stores of vegetable foodstuffs, might fearful mammals not be encountered? In the large clearings left by fallen trees, gnawed by time, I noticed leguminous plants, Acerinae, Rubiaceae, and 1,000 edible shrubs, much appreciated by the ruminants of all periods. Then there appeared, all intermixed and intertwined, trees from highly different countries on the surface of the globe, the oak growing beside the palm tree, the Australian eucalyptus leaning on the Norwegian fir, the northern birch mingling its branches with the New Zealand kauri. It was enough to upset the sanity of the most ingenious classifiers of terrestrial botany. Suddenly I stopped short. I held my uncle back. The uniform light made it possible to see the smallest objects in the depths of the thicket. I thought I saw, no, I really did see, enormous shapes wandering around under the trees. They were in fact gigantic and imals, a whole herd of mastodons, no longer fossil, but fully alive, and resembling the ones whose remains were discovered in the bogs of Ohio in 1801. I watched these great elephants with their trunks swarming about below the trees like a host of serpents. I heard the sound of their great tusks as the ivory tore at the bark of the ancient tree trunks. The branch 120 Hoffmann's, Shadow, E. T. A. Hoffmann, 1776–1822, German writer. The character is Peter Schlemihl, referred to in New Year's Eve as drawn from The Shadowless Man, or The Wonderful History of Peter Schlemihl, 1814, by Adalbert von Chamisso, 1781–1838. But the essential idea here is undoubtedly the traditional one that a person who loses his shadow is in the land of the dead. 121 Cypress and Thujas. The cypress traditionally represents mourning, and the thuja is also known as the arbor vitae, tree of life. The juxtaposition of opposites is a favorite topos of Verne's, cracked, and the leaves, torn off in great clumps, disappeared into the monster's massive maws. So the dream where I had seen the rebirth of this complete world from prehistoric times, combining the tertiary and quaternary periods, had finally become a reality. And we were there, alone in the bowels of the earth, at the mercy of its fierce inhabitants. My uncle was gazing. Suddenly he seized me by the arm, crying, "Come on. Forward, forward. No, no. We are unarmed. What could we do amongst these giant quadrupeds? Come, uncle, come. No human creature can brave the anger of these monsters unscathed. No human creature," said my uncle, lowering his voice. "You are wrong, Axel. Look over there. It seems to me that I can see a living creature, a being like us, a man." I looked, shrugging my shoulders, determined to push incredulity to its furthest limits. But struggle as I might, I had to give in to the evidence. There, less than a quarter of a mile away, leaning against the trunk of an enormous kauri tree, was a human being, a Proteus of these underground realms, a new son of Neptune, shepherding that uncountable drove of mastodons. 122 Immanis Picorus Custos, Imanier IPSE. 123, Imanier IPSE, indeed. This was no longer the fossil creature whose body we had propped up amongst the bones. This was a giant, able to command these monsters. He was more than 12 feet tall. His head, as big as a buffalo's, was half hidden in the brush of his wild locks, a real mane, like that of the elephants of the first ages. He swung in his hand an enormous bow, an appropriately primeval crook for this shepherd from before the flood. 124 We remained motionless, in a daze. But we might be spotted. We had to retreat. Run for it, I shouted, dragging my uncle with me, who for the first time in his life didn't resist. 122 Proteus, a minor sea god, herdsman of the flocks of the sea, had the power to take on many shapes. Neptune, Roman god of the sea, part of the ritual of his festival was the building of shady arbors, umbri, made of boughs. Verne is here hinting at a parallel evolutionary tree. 123 Immanis Picorus Custos, Imanier IPSE, guardian of a monstrous herd, and more monstrous himself. Verne is borrowing this quotation from Victor Hugo, Notre Dame de Paris pt 4, ch. 3, which adapts Virgil, Bucolica, v. 44, Formaci Picorus Custos Formacier IPSE, guardian of a fine herd, finer still himself. 124 Bow, shepherd from before the flood, cf. Books 11 and 12 of the Odyssey, where Ulysses in Hades sees a giant pursuing wild animals with a club in his hand. A quarter of an hour later, we were out of sight of this redoubtable foe. And now, when I consider it calmly, now that peace has returned to my mind, now that months have gone by since this strange, this supernatural, encounter, what am I to think, what am I to believe? No, it's just not possible. Our senses must have been mistaken, our eyes can't have seen what they saw. No human creature lives in that underground world. No race of men populates those deep caverns of the globe, oblivious of the inhabitants of the surface, not communicating with them in any way. It's insane, deeply insane. I would rather believe in the existence of some animal with a humanoid structure, some ape from the first geological eras, some Protopithecus, some Mesopithecus like the one discovered by M. Lartet in the bone-laden bed of Sansan. 125 But this one was far bigger than all the measurements known to modern paleontology. Never mind, however unlikely, it was an ape. But a man, a living man, and with him a whole generation entombed in the bowels of the earth. Never. Meanwhile we had left the clear, luminous forest, speechless with shock, weighed down by a stupefaction that came close to brutishness. We couldn't help running. It was a real flight, like those terrifying automatisms that one sometimes gets caught up in nightmares. Instinctively we made our way towards the Leidenbrock Sea. I do not know what wild paths my mind would have taken me along, if a particular worry hadn't brought me back to more practical considerations. 126 Although I was certain I was covering ground we hadn't been over before, I kept noticing groups of rocks whose shapes reminded me of Port Grouben. This in fact confirmed what the compass had indicated, that we had unintentionally headed back to the north of the Leidenbrock Sea. Sometimes it all seemed uncannily similar. Hundreds of streams and cascades fell from the rocky outcrops. I imagined I was back near the lair of Sir Tarbrander, near our faithful Hans Bach and the grotto where I had come back to life. Then, a few yards further on, the shape of the cliffs, the appearance of a stream, the surprising outline of a rock made me start doubting again. I mentioned my hesitation to my uncle. He was wondering like me. He was unable to find his way through this uniform vista. Point 127, we obviously didn't come back to the exact point we left from, I said. But the storm must have brought us back to just below it, and by following the coast, we'll reach Port Grauben again. 128,125 Lartet, Edouard A. I.H. 1801-71, French archaeologist, one of the founders of paleontology. In 1864 he discovered an ivory blade depicting a mammoth in the Dordogne area. 126 considerations. This is the end of the main section of new text added in the 1867 edition. 127I, Vista, 1864 edition. The professor shared my hesitation. He was unable to find his way in this uniform vista. I realized this from the occasional words that he uttered. If that is true, then there seems no point in carrying on with this exploration, and it is best to return to the raft. But are you absolutely sure, Axel? It's difficult to be definite, uncle, for all the rocks look so similar. But I think I remember the promontory where Hans built the raft. We must be near the little harbor. And it may even be here, I added, examining a creek I thought I recognized. Point 129, but then we would at least have come across our own traces, and I see nothing. But I do. I cried, springing towards an object glimmering on the sand. What is it? There. I showed my uncle the rust-covered knife I had picked up. Well, he said. So you brought this weapon with you? No, I didn't. But did you? Not that I know, I have never had this thing on me.